An allotment in North London. Police are searching for a missing woman.
They gain entry to the allotments and whilst they're looking for her, they're calling her phone.
They're making their way to her plot. They're still ringing her number and they hear the sound of a phone ringing.
They hear it coming from a locked shed.
There's a padlock on the door. Inside, they will find the body of 80-year-old Lea Adri-Soejoko. She's been murdered.
When they broke into the shed, they found the terrible sight of Lea dead within there. She was wearing Wellington boots, she had an apron on, and unfortunately a cord around her neck. She was also found to have a set of the keys to that particular shed in her pocket.
The suspect list was a small one, and as police investigated, the family of Lea Adri-Soejoko came to realise their mother had been murdered by a friend. It added to their devastation.
A lot of people said they can't imagine what a family like this goes through, and I always said, don't try. In the end, it's the worst thing in the world. To lose anyone to violence, it will completely turn your world inside out.
Who was responsible for murder on the allotment? Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Raheem Muhammadi as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? Set within the neat rows of houses of an area of North London known as Colindale is a much prized parcel of land, divided carefully into rows. And each of those rows is tended lovingly by someone who has rights to grow plants and flowers in a corner of the capital of England over which they retain control. One such person was Lea Adri-Soejoko.
Lea Adri-Soejoko was a very fit and healthy lady in her early 80s. She was and had been for many years the secretary of the Colindale allotment. Her home, which she had occupied for about 40 years by the time she died, was but 150 metres from the main entrance to the allotment.
She had made London her home and her hobby the allotment, two factors which would contribute to her murder. One solved because of a key mistake made by a killer, and it was because of a key.
It was very strange that she was inside the shed, but the shed door was locked, and that reduced the amount of suspects really that the police were interested in talking to, because there were only a certain number of keys. Now, Lea had hers on her. There were a couple of other keys that were either broken, unusable, people were out of the country.
An allotment is a peculiarly British thing, a place to garden and grow if you don't have a space of your own, or if yours is too small.
She really liked it there. She liked being able to grow her own food. She liked having something to go to do. She liked, I think, meeting the people there. And then when she started, I think, when she joined the committee and they asked her to do that, she enjoyed that. She enjoyed meeting all the different people.
Colindale is a residential suburb on the northern edge of London that enjoys a great deal of cultural diversity. Lea herself had moved from overseas and made North London her home. Lea's son Mark recalls how much she relished welcoming new faces to the allotment.
After she retired, she liked basically being busy, having something to do, having something that basically made things better for, not just for her, but for, for other people, enabling people to use the allotments and, helping organise all of that. She really enjoyed it.
Lea knew what it was like to have to find your feet in an unfamiliar place.
My mum was from Belgium. She was born, I think, in Antwerp in 1936.
In the early 60s, whilst training to be a bookkeeper, she met and fell in love with the man who was to become her husband.
They got married in 1965, and then I think in early 1966 they moved to London. Dad's job moved him to London, and they came over, and they stayed in London ever since.
Lea and her husband Antonius quickly found their feet in the UK. They settled in North London, had 3 children. Lea's house in Colindale had a garden that she loved to tend. It was that which ignited a passion for gardening that led her to getting an allotment. There, she soon became a familiar face.
Well, there was the garden at home, which she used to do a lot of the work in. You know, Dad would mow the lawn, she would work in the flower bed. She liked cooking, so she liked to have vegetables, and she liked to grow those, so there would be tomato plants around and stuff like that.
John Price is the barrister who would one day be charged with prosecuting the man who took the life of Lea Adri-Soejoko.
She was well known to all of the plot holders. She'd been the secretary of it for many, many years, and she was much loved by them all.
They all really loved her. She didn't take sides. She was there trying to make sure that everybody was able to enjoy the allotments as much as possible.
One of those allotment holders was Raheem Muhammadi, and from the moment that he arrived in Colindale, he would benefit from Lea's acceptance and kindness. His was a tortured life story, literally.
Raheem Muhammadi was a refugee from Iran. His origins were in the Kurdish community in Iran.
Raheem Muhammadi was a man who had multiple problems. He said that those problems came from the torture that he had suffered in Iran, and he did have lots of scarring on his body. He seemed to have lots of medical problems and suffered quite badly with back pain.
And he came over to the UK in 2005, where he sought asylum. The basis of his claim was that he'd been subject to torture, and he carried some significant injuries. He had a glass eye.
On the face of it, a vulnerable-looking man who had lots of problems.
A charity called Freedom from Torture nurtured relationships with allotments across the country. What better way to help refugees escaping abuse than to offer them a piece of land of their own to cultivate?
It was a charity that helped people who had experienced torture or had escaped really cruel regimes.
He was introduced by a charity to the allotment really as therapy to help him deal with the effects of what had happened to him in Iran.
A refugee, a victim of torture, debilitated by his injuries, a fish out of water in a new country. Raheem had struggled to find his place in the busy hustle and bustle of London. But when he started visiting Colindale allotments, it was as though he'd found his niche. As well as attending as part of therapy sessions, he soon began visiting on his own. And despite the fact that there was a 7-year waiting list for a plot, Raheem Muhammadi was able to get one of his own, and quickly.
There came a time in 2013 when he acquired his own plot. He lived alone. He had a bedsit in Hackney, and he used to travel to the allotment on public transport pretty much every day. It was quite obvious that by the early part of 2017, it was the centre of his life.
In busy London, the allotment was an oasis of calm for a refugee like Muhammadi, a place of friendship for the man who'd suffered torture. Lea Adri-Soejoko looked out for him. A local journalist, Rhys Handley, spoke to others on the allotment who knew her.
She sort of took this very traumatised and very troubled man under her wing.
And at first, Raheem Muhammadi responded by blossoming into a friend and enthusiastic fellow allotmenteer. How could Lea possibly know that a picture was building? Not one framed by flowers and allotment goings-on, but of the killer she had allowed into her life. It was the common bond of gaining purpose from toiling on the Colindale allotment in North London which established a friendship between committee member Lea and the troubled refugee Raheem. A bond which would from time to time be tested by Mr. Muhammadi's occasional flashes of temper. Despite that, she looked for the good in him.
She knew that people were difficult, you know, and they had issues and they weren't always nice, but she wouldn't hold that against them. She would always try and find something good about them. And I think that's one of the things we did learn from her. Sometimes maybe she was a little too trusting.
For many years, it was apparent that the relationship between them was a good one. There is no reason to think that, as with everybody else, he became very fond of her, not least because she was extremely good to him. She indulged him.
Over-indulged him, perhaps. She invited him to her home every now and again for a cup of tea and a chat.
She did things to try and help him. She worked with him. You know, I think he did the odd job around the garden, at house, cutting things back.
Lea involved Raheem in the running and the administration of the allotment. He was handy with machines, so he helped maintain equipment, and he mowed the communal paths. As time went on, he craved even greater involvement and more control over how the allotments were run. And he was to get that control.
He became more and more involved in the running of it. He became active, he was growing fruit, he was growing veg. He'd been invited on to help with the committee by Lea Adri-Soejoko. He became an active member of the committee and seemed to take a great deal of delight in being part of it.
She welcomed into the allotments and sort of opened up these positions for him on the committee for the Colindale allotments.
Getting a place on the allotment committee to a troubled, lonely asylum seeker seems to have been a tremendous achievement. He had become one of the central figures in an organisation that he'd come to love in his new home. He was given keys to the communal buildings, a rare honour. This was a proud moment. He had been accepted. Raheem's horrific past, which had left him maimed for life, was over. But getting a key to an allotment shed would also signal the start of a murder story, because this small amount of power, the power to unlock a communal shed, would decidedly go to Raheem's head. The allotment became his second home. Each time he travelled by bus and tube to get there.
It occupied nearly all of his time, and he was very heavily involved in the politics of the allotment. And he came to have strong views about how it should be managed.
There were a couple of disputes over just the general running of the allotment, just sort of stuff that sounds like quite sort of tedious and busybodyish, maybe even a little bit petty and that kind of thing. But obviously, when you live in a community like this, those things are so important to you, and something like an allotment is a very personal thing for a lot of people. So obviously, Lea took a lot of pride in what she was doing here, and I imagine Raheem probably felt very precious about it as well.
On Raheem Muhammadi getting the keys to the Colindale allotment communal shed, his fellow gardeners discovered they had sown seeds of discontent as one by one he would pick arguments with his allotment neighbours. Lea Adri-Soejoko was often called on to settle disputes. At first, she kept the stressful encounters with Raheem Muhammadi from her family.
She wasn't going to try and make me worry. She didn't want to burden me with stuff, and she was kind of, she managed her business. She would get on and manage her business, and she wouldn't burden other people with it. She wouldn't lay it on any of us, her children.
Lea suffered in silence, but like an unwanted weed, Raheem Muhammadi soon proved difficult to work around or to get rid of. As soon as he achieved his ambition of joining the committee at Colindale, newfound power in a new land started to go to his head. He didn't like the way that Lea ran the allotment, and he wasn't afraid to make his feelings clear.
Just after Muhammadi had joined the management committee, things started to change. He started to change. He became quite upset about the way that he saw that Lea was running things.
There was increasing tension between him and Lea Adri-Soejoko because he found himself increasingly frustrated by the way in which she managed the allotment. And whereas he would have had her be much harsher on what he saw as infractions of the rules by other plot holders, he only ever found her looking for a way to resolve disputes, to diplomatically deal with incidents, and to try and find a way of resolving problems without causing conflict.
She did not impose what she wanted on other people. She would not impose on people at all, that kind of way.
Muhammadi was a stickler for the rules. When other gardeners did things he didn't think were right, holding noisy parties on their plot, building fences above regulation height, he demanded that the committee come down hard on them. In meetings, he was becoming increasingly vocal about the way things should be done. That wasn't Lea Adri-Soejoko's style. She believed the allotments were there for everybody to enjoy, and she stuck to her guns.
She wouldn't take nonsense, particularly, and she wouldn't, let's say, let people steamroller her. She wasn't a pushover. At the same time, though, she would never roll over somebody else. She knew what she wanted, and she knew what she would stand up for and what she would need it, and she would make sure she got it, but she would do it in a way that didn't hurt other people.
Things came dramatically to a head one night at one of the committee's regular meetings. An allotment holder had started keeping chickens and rabbits in his shed. That was against the association's rules. Lea favoured a diplomatic approach. Muhammadi insisted angrily that the man must be evicted.
There seemed to have been some very cross words exchanged at a committee meeting where he was quite abusive to her in a fairly open forum.
Her family were becoming concerned.
Don't get too engaged with this guy. Don't get involved beyond what you have to do the stuff for the allotments. You know, be polite, you know, but don't get involved. Don't bring him in any more than you need to.
But Lea was not about to allow herself to be bullied.
He was venturing his view on the matter, and there came a moment when she told him to shut up. And this, according to the other committee members, greatly angered him. He was described as being extremely cross. He appeared very offended at having been told by her to shut up.
He shouted insults back at her in front of everybody else. I mean, he called her an old witch, you know, among other things. And it was really quite nasty and very, very awkward for everybody.
What he said may have been much worse, but his precise words were soon to be in dispute. Lea and her fellow gardeners were horrified that things had got so out of hand. They hadn't really seen this side of Muhammadi before. He'd always been passionate, but now he seemed dangerous, unpredictable.
He had to be pacified. He accepted that there'd been an incident which he regretted and which should not have occurred.
Shocked and upset, Lea immediately tried to make amends. But after that violent altercation, things were never the same again between the elderly woman and her one-time friend and protégé.
After that argument, Lea probably felt a bit bad because she went to Muhammadi and she apologised and she tried to make things right between them. But Muhammadi really did not respond in a way I think that she expected.
Lea had offered an olive branch to him and tried to be a bit of a peacemaker and make things all good again.
To no avail, as emails would later establish.
A number of emails which she'd clearly printed off, and therefore it clearly had had an effect on her, which he had sent to her in the immediate aftermath of this meeting, in which again he had spoken to her over a period of days in those emails in really quite aggressive, unpleasant and intemperate terms.
Did he up the ante? He was sending abusive emails, he was being really rude about her, saying he could run the allotments better and criticising her handling of the finances.
Unsettled, scared even by Muhammadi's behaviour, Lea requested that a note be made in the committee's files of Muhammadi's aggressive outburst. He responded by suggesting to the rest of the committee that Lea was abusing the Allotment Association's finances, something which was an outright lie. Raheem Muhammadi was clearly determined to assert dominance and control over the situation any way he could. Lea responded by taking a step back from their earlier established friendship.
She was, a bit wary of him in trying to, basically distancing herself slightly in terms of, okay, she would work with him for stuff in the allotment and, but not get involved with anything personally.
She continued to try and treat him with the consideration and the fairness that she had always done. But I think whereas in the past he was a frequent visitor to her home, that would not have caused her a problem. I think such closeness between the two of them was not so welcome.
More than unwelcome, Lea told close family members she was becoming frightened.
From things that she had subsequently said to her granddaughter and to her daughter about what was taking place, that she was, to use their phrases, that she was increasingly wary of him. And having seen what he'd done at the meeting in the presence of others, and having seen the emails that he was prepared to send to her as a way of trying to coerce her into doing what he wanted her to do, she was ever more unsettled by his behaviour and, as they said, ever more wary of him.
Though Lea was now on her guard around Raheem Muhammadi, she had no way of knowing just how much danger she was in, despite a stream of angry emails.
No one seemed to have the impression that she could provoke someone to do something like this, and obviously no one deserves to have something like that happen to them, but with Lea it was an especial shock because she was known as a decent and upstanding person.
As shocked as she and others were, nobody could possibly know how far Raheem Muhammadi was prepared to take his anger. Lea Adri-Soejoko was in grave danger, down on the allotment. The 27th of February 2017 was a day like any other for Lea Adri-Soejoko and Raheem Muhammadi. He planned to travel across London to spend most of the day at the allotment. She would spend the morning at home before walking over to her plot, just meters from her house on Collindeep Lane.
It was a date in late February. It was a wet and miserable day. There were very few people on the allotment.
Lea was seen heading to the allotment site just after 2:30 in the afternoon by a former plot holder.
She had been due to meet a very good friend of hers to go to a meeting of the Harrow and Wealdstone Allotment Society, and it was going to involve a journey by her from Colindale tube station and then taking a bus to arrive at the venue at about 7:30 that evening. And she'd arranged to meet her friend shortly before that near the bus stop where she was due to disembark.
The meeting had been set up via phone calls.
He was the last person that she ever spoke to, and they'd confirmed that arrangement.
Lea has an appointment to go and meet a friend, but she doesn't make that appointment, and the friend is really quite worried and raises the alarm, wondering where she is.
He had then called her starting at just after 6 o'clock, and his calls to her went to voicemail. And he called her about 3 or 4 times between 6 and 6:20, and each of the calls went to voicemail.
Lea Adri-Soejoko was someone who kept her appointments. She wouldn't have left her friend waiting without calling him to explain why.
She was always mindful of what others needed and what they wanted, and she would not, let's say, ignore their needs or just brush them aside. She wouldn't do that.
And when she didn't turn up, he went back to the house at which her granddaughter lived. And so it became known to the family that she hadn't kept this appointment.
So after searching fruitlessly for Lea for a number of hours, they decided to call the police.
They took themselves to Colindale police station, reported her missing. Because of her age, the police immediately treated this as an urgent case. She was treated as a vulnerable person.
Lea had never disappeared before. She'd always answered her phone. She was always careful not to give her children and grandchildren any cause for concern. Scared, confused, Lea's family worried that she'd been taken ill, perhaps fallen badly, and was lying in the dark in need of urgent help. Her daughter went looking for her.
The police assisted her with a search and in the early hours of the morning, and they went to the allotment just to search the general allotment area.
They're making their way to her plot. They're still ringing her number, and they hear the sound of a phone ringing. They realise that that might be hers because obviously it coincided with them using their phone, so they followed that sound, ringing the number again, and it took them to the mower shed. The phone could clearly be heard coming from within the shed.
How had her mobile phone come to be in there? Neither the family nor the police had a key for the lock. It was too urgent to wait. Officers set about forcing open the door. What they found inside was the stuff of nightmares.
When they get inside, they see Lea's body lying there.
She was wearing Wellington boots, she had an apron on, and unfortunately a cord round her neck.
Lea Adri-Soejoko was dead. She was wearing her gardening clothes, old trousers, and an apron. Her head and face were covered with an old coat. Underneath the coat, they found her face was badly bruised. A lawnmower cord wrapped around her neck. When police examined Lea more closely, they discovered something that would prove to be pivotal in their investigation. The killer's mistake, which would lead them very quickly to the door of a murderer.
It was very strange that she was inside the shed, but the shed door was locked.
The padlock on the mower shed was one which required the use of its key not merely to unlock it, but to lock it.
And when searching her, they found the keys to the locked shed in her pocket.
Her padlock key was on her allotment keyring in the pocket of the jacket that she was wearing inside the shed.
And that reduced the amount of suspects, really, that the police were interested in talking to, because there were only a certain number of keys. Now, Lea had hers on her.
They would have also then been thinking about who else has a key and who could possibly have locked that shed with Lea dead inside.
The killer could not have used Lea's key to lock the lawnmower shed. He or she must have had their own to relock the shed when leaving. Apart from Lea, only 4 other people held those keys. Who had locked Lea in that shed, and who had killed her? Colindale allotments became a crime scene, and the investigation that followed would send shockwaves through a residential neighbourhood.
It was a bit of a shock for the local community, I think, for it to happen. And everyone was just a little bit desperate to know what was going on. Everyone was concerned for their safety and that kind of thing.
People don't get killed on allotments, except somebody had been killed. In a corner of North London, a real-life murder mystery had begun.
Colindale is quiet, Colindale's unassuming, it's diverse but it's vibrant. It's got community things like the allotment going on, and often most of my coverage was related to community things, village fairs and you know, children dressing up for book day and that kind of thing. It was a little bit of a shock to see it come through on the newswire and to get tip-offs from residents saying that Colindale was where a potential murder had happened.
The Metropolitan Police's major investigations team was called to the scene. The local journalist Rhys Handley had never seen activity like this in Colindale.
When I got here, there was already a cordon put up. It was quite hard to get close. I couldn't get even as near as this when I was here last time.
Once the site was sealed off, detectives set about finding out who had keys to the lawnmower shed where Lea's body had been found. Apart from Lea, there were 4 others to track down. Officers soon learned one of them was Raheem Muhammadi. It meant he was a person of interest. As well as his status as a key holder putting him in the frame, his behaviour on the day of the murder was arousing serious suspicion. On being confronted by a police cordon when he arrived at the allotment that morning, Muhammadi showed no curiosity about why he couldn't enter. He simply walked away.
He made no inquiry of the police on the gates as to why they were there. But much more significantly, he didn't ring her up to say, Lea, what's going on at the allotment? Why is it closed? And of course, she only lived 150 yards from the gate. He didn't pop round to the house to see what the problem was.
Why? Because he already knew exactly what had happened. As police began to make their inquiries, a post-mortem was carried out on Lea's body.
She was strangled using the starter cord of the disused allotment lawnmower in the lawnmower shed. She was badly beaten up. She had sustained a number of recent blunt force impacts which had caused, amongst other things, fractured ribs, serious bruising to her face, including around her mouth, and there was a minor fracture to one of the vertebrae at the back of her neck.
Whoever had killed her had to be able to access the shed that her body was found in. Was not realizing how few people had a key, the mistake which would cost Raheem Muhammadi a lifelong prison sentence. There had been an extraordinarily violent attack on an 80-year-old woman. What on earth could have caused aggression of such magnitude, especially against somebody who was well-liked, who'd never hurt so much as a fly in her life? Reporters were hearing all about Lea Adri-Soejoko.
From what I know from the people that I spoke to, she was a lovely woman. She was unassuming, but she was also very dignified. She was very generous, and she was very open and decent. She was happy to lend a hand to anyone who asked.
For her children and grandchildren, a tragedy which bordered on the absurd.
If you read about it, or you saw it as something in a drama, you think, no, that's just stupid. And it is. It's such a stupid, wasteful, wicked act. It made no sense at all. It's utterly senseless, and it is so ridiculous. Mum wouldn't hurt a person, hurt anything or anyone.
While Lea's family and friends reeled from the shock of her murder, police followed the trail of the keys.
There were a couple of other keys that were either broken, unusable, people were out of the country.
The inquiry would have looked hard at who had access to that shed and where exactly all the keys and the key holders would have been. They found that one of the key holders was currently on holiday in Peru. Another had left the allotment at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they could, I think, quite easily demonstrate that. And that the other key was entirely bent out of shape and wouldn't have worked in the lock. So that only left Muhammadi.
Raheem Muhammadi had been proud to become a member of the allotment committee. It had been a mark of status, acceptance, when he was handed his set of keys. Now they were bringing suspicion to his door, so he had to answer for his movements.
From the very start, although admitting that he was present on the allotment that afternoon, denied that he had any involvement in her death at all.
He gave inconsistent accounts of his movements around the time. He did claim that he'd been to see Lea in order to return a tape measure. He did say he'd been to the allotment that day, and he did talk about hearing a drunken fight, but just discounted it as nothing.
He said he'd been gardening for most of the day. He claimed he'd only left the site once to visit the shops on the nearby Edgware Road, and that he had seen nothing untoward at the allotment before returning home. But, piece by piece, detectives were gathering evidence that exposed his lies.
In line with nearly all murder inquiries, CCTV plays an enormous part. And extensive CCTV inquiries in the local area close by the allotment showed him active at the times when she'd last been seen.
CCTV on the Edgware Road captured this defendant going to and from that shopping area on 3 separate occasions.
When asked why he had been along the road so often and hadn't volunteered the information earlier, Muhammadi admitted something to the police that they had not expected. He said he needed drugs.
He introduced into the case the fact that he had an opium habit and that he was supplied with opium by another plot holder, and of course That enabled him also to explain why he had not revealed that he'd been down there 3 times, because he said he didn't want to tell the police that he'd been buying opium.
Detectives never got to the bottom of Muhammadi's lies about his movements that day, why he tried to hide his comings and goings from the allotments, but they suspected it was tied up with Lea's murder. And as their inquiries progressed, they found even more damning evidence against him. DNA on the cord used to strangle Lea.
It was accepted that the DNA found on the cord that matched his profile was indeed his, but it was his case that the obvious explanation for that was as a result of him, in fact, having replaced the cord several years ago when it needed to be done.
Raheem Muhammadi continued to deny his guilt. But the police were building an ever clearer narrative of what had happened at Colindale allotments on the evening that Lea had died. Both had gone to the site to tend to their plots, but at some point their paths crossed. They rowed in one shed before tragic events played out in another.
There was an encounter between the two of them in the committee shed next door, much as had happened in that same building 6 months earlier. There had occurred a row of some sort, but this time there was nothing to inhibit him because there was no one else there. And he lost it, and he hit her.
There was clearly a violent altercation. Lea was violently assaulted.
So there was a hot-blooded assault, and then suddenly this man, whose life was the allotment, was faced with a lady, possibly partly conscious or unconscious at his feet, whom he'd hit, and of course who knew who had done this to her. And our case was that he knew that his days on the allotment were finished if she was allowed to identify him as being the person who had done this to her.
At that moment, Raheem Muhammadi had a choice to make. He could have sought help for Lea, called an ambulance, but if he had done that, she would have reported the attack. He stood to lose everything. He'd be booted off the allotment. He might face jail. The refugee might even be deported.
He took the decision, there's no other way of putting it, he took the decision that she had to die.
To complete the murder, Muhammadi felt that he had to move to the allotment shed to which he had a key so very few people had.
He unlocked the shed next door, he picked her up, he took her in there, he laid her out, and then he applied the cord to her neck to kill her in order to prevent her from reporting the fact that he had beaten her up. It was a cold-blooded killing carried out to cover up a hot-blooded assault.
Raheem Muhammadi covered Lea Adri-Soejoko's face with an old coat, left the shed, locking the heavy padlock with his own key. Though he didn't know it, it was at that moment that he secured his own conviction. What did he plan to do next? Was he going to return to the shed in the dead of night and move her body? The next part of his plan never became clear, because even when charged with murder and faced with all of the evidence, Muhammadi refused to admit his guilt, to tell the full story.
Mr. Muhammadi protested his innocence before the trial, during the trial. He protested his innocence to the jury after he'd been sentenced. As far as I am aware, he protests his innocence still.
Some found it hard to believe that Muhammadi was a killer.
He called witnesses as part of his case, and there was a particular individual who worked for the charity that had placed Mr. Muhammadi on the allotment all those years ago, who was still a supporter of his, came to give evidence for him. And it was quite apparent from the way in which that gentleman gave his evidence that he genuinely found it very difficult to believe that Mr. Muhammadi could have been responsible for so appalling and serious an act of violence.
But he was responsible, despite his denials.
He displayed a level of cunning and care in what he had to say, and he thought very carefully about how he might best explain the evidence that was relied upon against him. He was vehement He protested loudly. He answered questions at great length. In his summing up, the judge was prompted to ask rhetorically of the jury, depending upon their view of the matter, whether a stage had been reached whereby Mr. Muhammadi had convinced himself that he had not done it.
His protestations fell on deaf ears. The strength of the evidence stacked up against him was just too strong. On November 30th, 2018, Raheem Muhammadi was found guilty of the murder of Lea Adri-Soejoko and sentenced to life in prison. He was told he would serve at least 19 years before he could be considered for release. As he was sent down, Muhammadi told the judge and the jury they were jailing an innocent man.
I think either he has convinced himself he didn't do it, or he's disassociated from it somehow. So it's not real. He actually, I think the only thing that came close to, from what I can understand, of him showing any kind of remorse is the fact that he covered her face. When her face was covered with an old coat when she was laid out. But other than that, I don't think he has shown any remorse or any acceptance of what he's done.
It was a most remarkable case. She was a remarkable and much-loved woman who did a great deal for many people who lived, worked and spent time on that allotment. The conduct of the case was very difficult. It was almost a throwback. This was, in many senses, an old-fashioned case in which the prosecution had to rely on a combination of circumstances to explain a story and to prove a man's guilt. And there are not many cases like that anymore.
The key piece of evidence was the key itself to the lawnmower shed where Muhammadi had left Lea's body after he had killed her. Being the only key holder without an alibi that afternoon was the one piece of evidence he simply could not explain away.
Clearly, the biggest mistake that Muhammadi made, he made a few, but the biggest mistake was locking that shed door. I think he locked that shed door because he didn't want anybody to find Lea before he'd had a chance to clean up or do whatever he was going to do. But it was that was his undoing.
Locking the shed with his own key placed Raheem Muhammadi firmly on the scene when Lea Adri-Soejoko was murdered. That was his killer's mistake, the reason he's been sentenced to life in prison. The guilty verdict, however, is not a consolation for the family of Lea Adri-Soejoko.
While we believe the right person has been found guilty, it's not something to feel good about at all, It's not about triumph or anything like that. It doesn't bring Mum back. A lot of people said that there'd be justice for her. If there was actually justice, it would never have happened.